The Black One. I have lived with my mother all my life. My father was gone soon after I was born, my mother told me. I never met my grandfather, grandmother, or any relatives. I thought that was the way it was. It was only much later that I realized that it was an unusual circumstance. I don't know when it happened, but I have a memory of having an older sister. I don't know if it is true, as it is a faint memory, like a dream. But when I told my mother about it when I was little, she scolded me severely for some reason. I was moving all the time in those days. I don't think I ever stayed in the same place for a year. When I asked my mother why, she replied that it was because I was being chased. When I asked her what was chasing her, she said, "Something very scary. No matter how far you run, it will always come after you." She also said, "The Black Ones are the first to find it." The way they moved in was also strange. When she woke up in the morning, her mother was suddenly packing up her belongings and preparing to leave the house. Since there were no household goods, the preparations were quick and easy. Then she would leave the house on her feet, without even greeting the neighbors. It was a hectic move, as if they were trying to escape from something that was happening right then and there. Everywhere she went, her mother met so-called psychics. The psychics chanted some kind of incantation or gave us various instructions and ordered us to follow them. But to no avail, our moving on went on and on. One psychic finally said something like this: "It is impossible for me to exorcise what possesses you. Perhaps there is no one who can exorcise it." When I was in the 4th grade, my mother and I moved into a temple. The head priest there had a local reputation for exorcising evil spirits. We began living in a remote corner of the temple. We did zazen from early in the morning every day. We were made to memorize sutras. Sometimes we did water purification and sometimes we were exposed to the smoke of the goma. The priest chanted sutras for us every day and repeated the purification rituals. Perhaps her mother was relieved by this, but she never moved again and continued to stay at the temple. In junior high school, I finally began to get used to the idea of living in one place. I made friends at school and studied as much as anyone else. I also began to participate in club activities. I began to feel alienated from life at the temple. When I told my mother about it, she got very angry with me. In the old days, I would have been surprised by her anger and obeyed what she said, but at that time I was rebellious and rebelled against her attitude. The mother is just delusional. There are no spirits, so what we are doing here is meaningless. The priest is using us as a pretext to advertise his psychic abilities. My thoughts at the time were generally like this. Many of the opinions and knowledge I could obtain at school and from the world at large confirmed these thoughts. The rebellious spirit against psychic things that had sprouted inside me was growing day by day. In the winter of my senior year of high school, I was awakened in the middle of the night by my mother's voice. I went out into the hallway and found the head priest and a living monk in front of his mother's room, peeking inside. The mother was half crazed and complaining about something. "The Black One is here, I'm screwed, I thought I was fine, I have to run away again. I thought it had started again. So I cursed at her, enough. I thought it was okay, and I have to run away again." The priest stared at me with fearful eyes, but said nothing. Fed up, I went back to my room and fell asleep. When I returned home from school the next day, I found a gamadan set up in the courtyard in front of our house. In front of my astonished eyes, my mother, dressed in white, began to chant sutras with the head priest right next to the gamadan. She would occasionally take a dip in the water and then head back to the gamadan. They repeated this over and over again. At first I watched the scene in dismay, but it soon became ridiculous and I returned to my room. Even in my room, however, I could hear chanting and shouting from outside. Deeply fed up, I left the temple and went to stay at a friend's house. The next morning, When I returned to the temple, to my surprise, the mother was still doing the same thing. I tried to stop her, but the head priest and other monks prevented me from doing so, and even asked me where she had been yesterday. I was so disgusted that I went back to my room and went to school, ignoring the priest who was still trying to stop me. This continued for about 3 days, and her mother, exhausted, collapsed and fell asleep in her room. The next day, she hanged herself in her room and died. I felt sadness and anger at the same time. I felt that it was the temple's fault that she had driven her mother to suicide. Her mother, an amateur, had been performing the ascetic rituals for 3 days, and she had finally taken her own life due to mental and physical exhaustion and insanity. I was convinced of this at the time. After the funeral, I caught up with the head priest and accused him of mistreating my mother, cursed him about life at the temple, and halfway out of the temple, I left. After dropping out of high school, I spent my time moving from place to place, changing jobs. After getting a large-size driver's license, I started driving a truck, but I never settled down in one place. Perhaps my childhood of moving around a lot had left a lasting impression on me. But then a turning point came for me. I got along well with a part-time girl at the company where I worked, and while we were dating, we had a child. We were already living together, and since the economy was booming and my earnings were stable at the time, we decided to get married. My parents were concerned about the fact that I was a lifelong solitary, but the marriage went smoothly, thanks to the fact that we had a child and the solid lifestyle we had been leading up to that point. Eventually, my children were born and I began to realize that I was settling down in the area. Although I was a long-distance driver and was often away from home, I felt a warmth in my family that I had never experienced before, especially when I was playing with my wife and children on holidays. At the time, I was wishing that this happiness would last forever. One day I woke up unexpectedly in the middle of the night, feeling somewhat uncomfortable and unable to sleep. My wife and our 2-year-old child were sleeping next to me. While I was watching them for a while, I felt something like a gaze and looked at the corner of the ceiling. There I saw a dark shadow. The room was slightly brightly lit by the light from a beam bulb, but that one corner was completely dark, as if no light was reaching it. When I strained my eyes, it seemed as if something was stirring behind it. Suddenly I remembered my mother's words. The black one will be the first to find it. I tried to shake off the silly thought, but it didn't work. Sleepless, I stared at it and waited for morning. The shadows faded as it became light outside. I went to work, sleep-deprived. The shadow appeared again the next night. As usual, I could feel its gaze staring at me from there. I could not sleep that night either. The next day I was off work, so I went to the hospital. The doctor told me that the hallucination was probably caused by stress and suggested that I take some time off work. He suggested, "Why don't you take some time off from work?" When I said I could not do that, he gave me some medicine. Despite the medication I took, I woke up again in the middle of the night. I looked in the corner of the room and saw a black shadow looking at me again. Perhaps it was my imagination, but it seemed larger than the day before. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind my back and turned around to see a samurai in armor standing in the tea room. I could not see his face because of his faceplate, but I could sense that he was looking at me. I almost held back a scream. I looked at my wife and child, desperately telling myself that I was hallucinating. An old woman in a white kimono was sitting on my wife's futon, staring at me. I lost consciousness. My hallucinations got worse day by day. I began to see not only armored warriors and old women, but also small children and dog-like beasts. When I consulted a doctor, he said, I consulted a doctor, only to be told, it's just a hallucination, just take the day off work. He was also told, it is possible that old memories of your mother or the temple are creating the appearance of a typical ghost. It certainly seemed that way. I left the hospital after receiving another dose of medicine. I pedaled my bicycle, thinking about taking a break from work. As I was waiting for the light at a crosswalk on the main street near my house, I saw my wife coming toward me from the front with our child in front of her. She seemed to be on her way to the store. When she saw me, she smiled and waved. The child also saw this and waved at us. The bicycle carrying the two crossed the intersection at the same speed. The light was still red. Right in front of me, my wife and child were hit by a truck coming straight ahead. From that point on, my memories are terribly vague. People from the hospital, police, my wife's parents, and various other people appeared in front of me, but I don't remember what they said to me or what they said to me. When I came to, it was nighttime, and I was lying on the futon for the three of us in our bedroom, in my place, looking blankly at the futon without my wife and child. Strangely enough, I don't think I cried. I looked at the ceiling and saw a shadow. But it didn't matter. I turned my head and saw the armored warrior and the old woman. I felt as if it didn't matter. I felt no fear. I looked again at the empty futon. There was that old woman sitting on my wife's futon. For the first time, I felt a rush of emotion. I felt terrible anger and sadness. Why are you there? Only my wife and children are allowed to be there. The only people I want here are my family. His wife, his children, his mother and father, his sister who may or may not have been there. I may have screamed, I may have stormed out, but when morning came, the room was still intact, with 3 sets of futons neatly lined up under my feet. More than 10 years have passed since then. I am still working as a long-distance driver, moving from place to place across the country. I will be 36 this year, but I am still single and have no intention of getting married. I intend to continue living this way until I die. He remains in denial about psychic phenomena. He believes that what happened was the result of coincidence and hallucination. He does not believe in an afterlife or grudges, nor does he want to believe in them. But if there really is an afterlife, and I am a ghost, I would find the spirit that took my family from me in the afterlife and beat it to death. This concludes this story. Thank you for listening to the end.